Thank you all for coming. Dave Hughes will be doing the introduction of our speaker today, and then we will go right to our speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest today is Colorado caver Donald Davis. Donald has made sustained, unique contributions to American caving, American cave history, and American cave science. But he has done it in a somewhat different way than many of the scientists in our midst. Donald does not have any fancy academic degrees in the field. Donald does not have an army of graduate students to help him with field work or with laboratory activities. Nor does he have enough money to pay a student. As a calibration point, Donald lived on a property in Colorado for decades that he paid a grand total of $3,310 for. Donald, at present, does not drive a car. He does not have a multi-story library with air conditioning and elevator access. But what Donald does have is a brilliant mind, a very observant pair of eyes, and a fearless willingness to look at problems in new and different ways. Please enjoy your afternoon with 2016 luminary Donald Davis.
As the introduction said, I'm a bit eccentric person, and I've always been somewhat of a loner, and I never had ambitions for a normal career as those things are usually thought about. I was hoping that my life would kind of work out differently, and it has in a peculiar way, and here I sit, a luminary, or so it seems. I'm a small town boy. I was born in 1938 and lived for some years in a series of small towns where my father was a high school teacher and a coach in their sport teams. And I, of course, living out in the eastern Colorado Plains, I didn't know about caves until age 4 when my parents took us to Colorado Springs and we took a tour of the Cave of the Winds. And I remember walking along the tour trail and seeing all these side openings going into darkness and wondering, where does that go? And little did I know at that time that many years later I'd have the opportunity to not only find out where every last one of those went, but to make them go farther. And then there was the following year, we moved to Globe, Arizona, where I got my first comic book at age 5, which happened to be a Classics Illustrated Tom Sawyer version. And I remember being fascinated by the comic book images of Tom Sawyer's cave in that comic book. So all of this was unknowingly priming me to become a caver later on, but for a number of years after that I had no way to actualize this interest. But then I ended up back in Colorado in high school at a little mountain town of Fairplay, where when we moved there and I started into high school, the older people that had just graduated did all this talking about a mysterious cavern up in the area west of town at Timberline that had been struck by a mine adit in the 1800s, and it had streams in there and went down to a huge room that was said to be big enough to hold the county courthouse, and that there were times in the night when the stream would burst forth and scare hell out of them and so forth. But they weren't inviting me to go there myself, but again I was storing up this intriguing stuff that I wanted to do. Then one day we were over at the little town Victor, a semi-ghost town, having a basketball game, a high school ball game. I didn't want to watch that, so I wandered around the town, and I went into an old mill and found a nice Autolite carbide lamp lying on a bench there, and somehow I'd learned what those were, so I picked it up, appropriated it, took it home, and went to this old miner I knew in Fairplay and asked him, could you show me how this works? And he was happy to do that. So then I got some carbide and stashed the lamp on a shelf and was ready to become a caver. So then I had scholarships to go to Colorado A&M College at Fort Collins, which 2 years during my tenure there became CSU. And it had a hikers club, which I immediately joined. And it happened that there were 2 or 3 people in the club who were interested in caves. So after I'd learned some basic vertical stuff, we went up to Table Mountain in southern Wyoming and dropped a 40-foot pit to get into Table Mountain Cave. Only about 400 or 500 feet of passage, but it was interesting and a bit challenging, and that was my first opportunity to do a wild cave. Then it happened too that the Fort Collins Museum had a scrapbook of newspaper clippings that included a bunch of things from the old Denver newspapers about La Caverna del Oro, or Spanish Cave, which was said to be high up on a mountain in the Wet Mountain Valley area, the Sangre de Cristos, and it had gold and skeletons and things like that in it. And the hikers clubbers had been searching for that, and the first year they were misdirected to the wrong mountain. But then in 1958, I went with Vin Homan, who later became a major mountaineer and was killed on the first American Dhaulagiri expedition. We went down to the Sangre de Cristos, and after climbing 2 14ers the first day, 2 the next day, on the third day we went up onto Marble Mountain and found 7 of the caves there, including a Spanish cave. And that was the last one we actually hit. And I remember that when we first crawled in through the icy wind in the entrance crawl, the 40 feet to the shaft that went darkly and dankly into the depths, I had this feeling, ooh, this is sinister, let's get out of here. However, I got over that over the next year, and the next season I went back and happened to encounter on the mountain cavers from the Southern Colorado Grotto based in Pueblo. They were about the same age as me and same level of noviceness in caving. So we hit it off, and rather than fighting each other over the turf, we joined forces and began exploring into Upper Spanish Cave, which had been left just a blank lead on the old Colorado Grotto map. And we had learned about the NSS already at that time. We had gone to a meeting or 2, but they didn't seem too interested in us, just young callow college cavers, so we didn't go very often. But when we started exploring Upper Spanish, we suddenly found ourselves going into passage with no footprints, no markings, and no map. We realized we are in Virgin Cave, and here it is, big walking galleries with big dome rooms coming here and there. So when we went back to the Colorado Grotto meeting and told them about that, suddenly they took an interest in us. And they began inviting us on some of the digs that they were doing in Fairy Cave, which eventuated decades later in Glenwood Caverns. But we continued being active on Marble Mountain and exploring this alpine cave that goes above timberline. And I had gotten a copy of Halliday's Adventures Underground book, which had a chapter on Spanish Cave and ended by saying the story of Spanish Cave is told, well, we had to beg to differ with that. So I began corresponding with Halliday, and at about that same time, I saw the NSS Bulletin 1960 Speleogenesis issue and read all the papers in that, and I realized I was seeing features of high-angled phreatic tubes, etc., in the Alpine cave that that the Eastern speleologists were not mentioning in these papers, and that there was an opportunity here actually to correct misconceptions and all, and that was really the origin of my interest in cave science. I saw here, even though I hadn't gotten an advanced degree, that I could contribute some totally new knowledge about these things, which I began doing whenever I could. I wrote for the Grotto newsletters, etc. Then in 1960, the year I graduated from college, I had heard that the NSS was having its convention in Carlsbad that year, and that there would be tours in the off-trail sections of Carlsbad. Now, I just had to do that, so I decided, well, I'm going to join this group so I can go there. We went to the convention, and there were the tours, and there were interesting stories about the Guadalupes and the lightning storms and things that I could tell, but I could speak all afternoon about this sort of thing, so I'll continue beyond that. And once I was in the NSS, I found that I liked the NSS bulletin and news and membership lists and contacts all over the country, so I've stayed in ever since. And I started caving actually in the year 1957 in the Hikers Club. And now let's see, also during the convention trip, I had a college friend who happened to know about Fort Stanton Cave, and we decided to drop in there on the way down, and got into the thing and went walking along the main corridor. And it was amazing to me. It reminded me of the things I'd been reading about Mammoth Cave, big sinuous river system type passages that seemed to have no real end to them. So that is where I got hooked on Fort Stanton, and I began going there at intervals. But about that time when I graduated from college, I was at loose ends, and I spent time in several western states doing various things, including a trip in 1962 to Utah and Nevada with Vin Homan, whose home country was in these states. And so I got to visit Cave Valley Cave and Whipple Cave and the Leviathan Cave. Then, just yesterday, I finally got back into Cave Valley Cave to take a more recent look at it. It was interesting to do. And so from there, everything just branched out, and I was caving in California, Arizona, and other western states, back in Colorado, here and there. And at this point, I could go any one of a bunch of different directions with talking to you all, but I'm thinking that probably, for one thing, I don't need slides up anymore. You've probably had your fill of slideshows for the last 3 days anyway. So I would open this to the audience to just tell me what aspects of my caving that you've heard of would you like to know more about, and I'll try to expound on it. Blaine.
I have a couple of suggestions. Perhaps the audience would be interested in the cave dilation theory. Perhaps they would be interested in the low-tech method for connecting the top and bottom in Spanish.
Oh, well, the dilation theory happens to be my most famous technical paper. Interestingly enough, that's actually true. The thing has been translated, I think, into at least 4 languages: Spanish, Norwegian, German, I think, French perhaps. And I dashed that off on a trip back from the Gauds one day, just in pencil, while Rich Wolfert was driving us back north, and I just meant it as a joke that if you don't know of it, it basically purports that speleogenesis, cave development, is not a geological or hydrological thing as conventional theory has it. Rather, it's parapsychological, or more accurately paranormal and psychokinetic, that the caves develop when enough unconscious psychic force has been concentrated in the right place. They suddenly pop in a quantum fashion into existence, and they can pop out of existence if that focus doesn't continue strongly enough, and that explains lost caves. And really, this theory explains more things about caves than any other one does. But granted, I don't have a lot of laboratory proof for it, but for that matter, neither do all of the cosmologists and all. Let's see. Oh, and Blaine also mentioned the method that we used to show that Upper Spanish and Lower Spanish connected. We had found an upper entrance, and the wind blew through, a chimney effect wind, but we weren't 100% sure that the entrance was connected. And it happened that I had run across a road-killed skunk near Fort Collins, and I milked it for about half a pint of skunk oil. It's not as bad as you think it might be, but then we took it up onto Marble Mountain, and we'd found the Frank's Pit entrance that sucked in the air, and one member of the team went up there and soaked a cloth in the skunk oil, and we went into the cave, and we were suddenly, midway through the cave, the fragrance hit us unmistakably. So we knew, yes, it was connected, and it happened that in 15 minutes we actually came to the place where we had last stopped coming down, so we'd have found it anyway, but that showed that there are unorthodox ways of figuring out where caves go. Yes.
What I'd like to do is give you the mic so that the house can hear your question. Then not necessarily read it so it's collected in the audio of the camera. Okay. So.
I'm familiar with some of your work, but I'm wondering, perhaps you could discuss maybe the 3 things that you have worked on that you found the most intriguing and feel like you made the most contribution about, and also where you think the average caver can make a contribution today. What do you think are the most interesting problems to work on?
The question is somewhat complicated, but it essentially, what do I think are the most interesting scientific discoveries that I've made through my career, and where I think this could go for other cavers? Well, one of them would certainly be discovering the subaqueous helictites in Lechuguilla Cave. We were up in the Pellucidar chamber, myself and photographer David Harris, early in the exploration of Lechuguilla. This is a big room, and we were looking around among the boulders to see if any pits might go down out of there. So I went over to this opening between 2 rocks and looked down, and rather than an air-filled pit, I saw this 8-foot deep pool, a narrow thing going down with a shelfstone rim around it, and this bunch of white spaghetti was growing out from under the shelfstone, from the edge of the shelfstone. And I knew instantly that this is nothing I'd ever seen in any other cave. So I began just yelping, oh, oh, oh! And I don't know what Dave thought, but either I was having an orgasm or had fallen or something, but it turned out to be closer to the former. He came over and he took one look, and he lost all prudence, and he wanted to get a photo of this lighted from underwater. So he dipped his strobe in the pool, and we didn't think to put a plastic bag around it, so it flashed once and never flashed again. But then I went back to the hut with this information, and it happened that Carol Hill at one point, well, let's see, I'm getting behind on this, but Carol Hill, I told her about this discovery, and she didn't believe it. She thought this was a kind of pool spar on page 78 or so of her book, Cave Minerals of the World. So a couple of weeks later, I got to go back to the pool with permission to collect one sample, and they are all fused down, but some of them had been broken, and I managed to break a piece and put it in a film can and take it back. And when I got back to the cabin the day after that, Carol Hill visited, and I had the thing, and I took it out, and I opened the can, and I found it was full of mush. I was absolutely horrified. What had I done to this sample? I put it in some of the water from the pool, and it was hard, and I didn't think it could possibly have been crushed in my getting out of the cave. But I was being crushed. And then Michael Queen revealed that he'd substituted a sample of mush for my specimen. And I could have killed him at the time. But it was actually, in retrospect, a fun trick played on me. And then Carol Hill comes in, and I have the real one back. So I, in effect, rub her nose in the central canal. Now, helictites have to have central canals. That's a defining condition of helictites. So, yes, it was. And then I got Art and Peg Palmer interested in it. And they took it back and checked it. And in the meantime, somehow I had learned about the common ion effect, by which if you have waters high in one ion, say calcium in this case, and mix with these waters, that sometimes you can get precipitation as a result of this. And this pool had a big gypsum wall right behind it, with flowstone flowing down under the gypsum and dissolving it. So we concluded, and their analyses confirmed, that this was in fact a new speleothem, a common ion effect speleothem, and that helictites could grow underwater because these tendrils of gypsum-enhanced water were coming out into the pool and then forming rings of precipitate around the capillary canal. So later, I thought perhaps the helictite bushes discovered in Wind Cave earlier might be somehow another kind of subaqueous helictite. I went into Wind and took careful observations of many of those, and I did get to be satisfied that they had grown subaqueously for half a dozen different reasons, rather than just being a variant of ordinary helictites, but they turned out to have a different and still poorly understood mechanism, which I think is more closely akin to submarine smokers than to ordinary helictites or even subaqueous helictites. And the nearest analog that we can see easily, I think, as the Mono Lake Towers that have some common elements. Made a sort of time travel possible if you can figure out something from what's in the cave preserved from the past, and you can run laws before and infer from that things about the surface conditions, whether there was an ice age going on at the time, for example, and get them to find out what their labs tell them about these things, and it seems that more often than not they have tended to confirm my intuitions, but I have made some mistakes, and some of those were early on in my career. For example, I think it was 1962, and I thought, caves are formed by descending water, and this has this big shale cap rock on top, so it's not very likely there'll be a cave here, so I didn't go look, and I could have discovered Groningen 5 years before it was, but at least the cave got saved for that long from being beaten on. But at that time I hadn't known anything about hypogenic caves, which is what Groningen is fundamentally, and you don't have to have a karst on the surface above the cave in order to have a cave underneath. I started to learn about more around 1970 when I was working at Carlsbad Cavern. I worked at a series of different things to make money in those years and sort of filed it away. And then when I began to find that there was elemental sulfur in the Guadalupe caves, in particular Cottonwood Cave, I didn't find it, but it was told by someone that it was there. I went up and back there and looked, and sure enough, a nice yellow sulfur. So I wrote that up for the NSS Bulletin, and a short time after that, another paper came out in the Bulletin from, please remind me of the author of the pyrite paper on the Guadalupes. Dave Yagnow, yes. He had also promulgated the sulfuric acid idea, but had suggested pyrite as the source. And I thought, well, there's pyrite up there, but it doesn't seem adequate in quantity to account for these huge voids. And it occurred to me that Egemeyer's idea would apply really neatly there. So I reread things there, and I put together a paper for the 1980 Bulletin suggesting that the sulfuric acid came by way of oxidizing hydrogen sulfide gas, and it was on record that there was lots of H2S in the under areas of Carlsbad region. So I put together a coherent notion for the hydrology of that and published it. So that, I think, was really the beginning of integrated studies of the Guadalupe cave hydrologies and the specifics of the sulfuric acid development of these caves, which tend to have short but very wide, large rooms. And I did perhaps make one mistake there of assuming that the recharge area was probably just up in Guadalupe Mountains National Park. But it turned out that Harvey Duchesne pointed out later that there'd been this rifting there, and that probably the real recharge for those upper caves had been many miles farther west at that time. So that was his advance. Yes.
Donald, you have extensive, legendary time spent in the Grand Canyon. Could you talk some of the early years and trips into the Grand Canyon and some of the exploits, please?
Yes, the Grand Canyon, so many stories I could tell about that, although some of them are still secret and not allowed. But I went first to the Grand Canyon in 1963, November of that year, I had arranged with Central Arizona Grotto members to visit Thunder and Tapeats Caves. And at that time, that was a really interesting thing to do, especially because the only topographic maps for that region that were in print were the Mathis Evans pair of maps of the park, and the region over Thunder and Tapeats Caves was literally terra incognita, blank on the map, and you seldom get a chance to get into something of that kind in the United States. So I drove my old Chevrolet pickup up to Jacob Lake and set up camp, and it snowed 6 inches that night. So they met me there, and we started down the back roads and began slipping and sliding on the mud where it was melting. And then we came to aspen trees that had fallen over the road. We had no axe or saw, so we ended up chopping trees with a shovel to get through. We couldn't turn around or back up, it was too slippery. And we ended up out on the rim above those caves, and it was still cloudy. The clouds are down a little over the rim, spitting snow. And we stopped on the rim, and I went over onto the edge and down a little ways looking, and the clouds were drifting by in the wind, and suddenly this rent in the cloud came along, and I saw down to the Esplanade platform 1,000+ feet below, and I began to widen my eyes and think, we're going down there. And then another rent came by, and I saw Upper Tapeats and the deeper gorge below the red wall, and then yet another, and clear down into the inner gorge. And it looked as if the thing was never going to stop, that there was just one level on another to infinity. And it even brought to mind the biblical phrase, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and as if the world was being created for me. And then we did go down there, and it worked out fine, and it was a lot of fun, and got to the backs of these, well, not to Thunder, actually, the back of Tapeats Cave. And that's what got me hooked on the Grand Canyon. So from then on, I spent some time, maybe an average of 2 to 4 weeks a year, in the canyon, climbing inner canyon peaks. At that time, there were several dozen named canyon summits that had not been ascended, and I got in touch with Harvey Butchert, the great inner canyon hiker, and got to doing things with him and corresponding, and I got to do a dozen first ascents. One of those was intriguing in the record sense, in that Novinger Butte was a first ascent, and I was climbing that up through the red wall, and I encountered a virgin cave there. It turned out to be some 400 feet long, so I got to do a virgin cave and a virgin summit on the same trip. I don't know if any other outdoorsman has quite that distinction. And one of the most interesting caves that I got into there was Falls Cave, which of course I did not discover, but I was around at the time, and John McLean in the audience was one of the people on that trip, I think in 1966, and we spent a 48-hour, or 46-hour actually, trip back in there, just bivouacked on our way out under blankets, and then got into the back of the cave, and only in the last year did anyone get farther in than that was when Jason Bolensky's trip. I found the penny I left there 40-some years earlier, and went beyond it several hundred feet, but ran into more dig difficulties getting farther. Another major cave there was Silent River Cave on the east rim in the neck of the Walhalla Plateau, an elaborate cave with both phreatic and vadose elements to it, and we were spending 20 and 21-hour trips back there trying to find out where it went. Especially intriguing thing was that the stream flow had been out toward the Nankoweap amphitheater in most of the cave, but in the interior we crossed a subterranean drainage divide and found a little stream going into the rim at that point, a weird thing. And I still haven't been able to find out if anyone's gotten beyond where I went at that time, but many other parties have explored in that cave since then, and they always seem to have difficulties of one sort or another, and it's never clear how far they've gotten, so it's still rather an enigmatic cave. And we discovered interesting things on the Wallapai Plateau, on the Wallapai Reservation, where that is no longer easily accessible. The Indians have tightened up on access. That was with Louise Howes, who's here, and many other cavers, mostly Californians. So I could go on, but I suppose that is enough for that at the moment. To have the degrees and know what is bullshit and what is significant. And when I can actually do something that these people think is significant, that's the reward I have.
So Donald, I know that our ethics are a little different perhaps than when you were doing this, but for people who are exploring in the western United States, would you explain the pennies?
Oh, well, it was a habit I had during the Grand Canyon years, primarily, that when I would go to some place remote and reach an end, a turnaround point that I wanted to mark, I would take a penny of the year. I would keep a supply in my pockets. And
to introduce ourselves, we're sitting here kind of like a couple of donkeys, quiet. We were asked to sit here to ask Donald questions in case you folks don't. You don't want us to ask him questions, so this is very good for us. We just sit here. I will ask him one question. Among your many, many major discoveries, one of the more unusual ones was the discovery of so far the longest soil piping cave in the United States, something that most people don't think about too much in terms of what you've done. Could you briefly describe, how you found that thing and what it is?
That was just a lucky accident. I'd been living at Rulison for 20-some years at that point in western Colorado along the Grand River Valley. And Rulison was 4 miles from the county dump, which was over under Anvil Point in the Eocene rocks there, claystone and sandstone. So one day my partner Chester and I were over at the county dump for some reason, and just 4 miles from my house, and then leaving the dump I noticed that there seemed to be a big black hole up in one place that you could only see from a certain spot along the graveled road there. So I thought, well, let's stop and go up there and see what that really is. So I did, and went several hundred feet up a ravine and came to a side thing and didn't see anything, and I almost turned around, but I went another few hundred feet and there it was, this big black hole up there. So I went running up there to look, and it turned out that what I was seeing was a natural arch that we later surveyed at 81 feet across internally and about 30 feet high. And underneath that arch there was a resurgence coming out of a ravine in this claystone. It wasn't running at the time, but it had obviously been pouring water out of a cave there. So before going in, I went up higher on the thing there and found that it was a debris flow surface up there and had sinkholes, several sinkholes in it. So then we began to explore the cave, and actually you can go from the main upper entrance to the lower one in around 10 minutes. It's most all walking through there. But unlike most of these claystone caves, it has several tributaries, and added together they all ended up coming to 2,050 feet. And so far, Doug Medville and others have been doing extensive looking at places like Cuts Canyon here in New Mexico, I'm not here in New Mexico, but there in New Mexico and finding more, but so far none has been bigger. One has gotten to be deeper a little bit. I think Anvil Point's was 187 or so feet vertical range. But they're intriguing caves and more interesting than you might think, and very little work has been done on such caves in the western U.S.
President, I was wondering how you got into selling Premier lamps.
Please repeat the question.
I was wondering how you got into selling Premier lamps.
Oh, Premier lamps, yes. For a time, I was the only importer of Premier carbide lamps into the United States, and that came about because the U.S. manufacturers of good caving carbide lamps, primarily Autolite, Guy's Dropper, and my own third place, Just Right, had all quit making them, and I was collecting antique carbide lamps at the time, and I learned about the Premier brand in Britain still being manufactured, so I sent away to get a sample of them, and I got it, and I liked it so well. It was better, I thought, than Just Right, and at least about as good as Autolite and Guy's Dropper. So I began to see if I could order them in numbers, and they let me do that. And so I began a mail order advertising or in the NSS News, and sold hundreds of them to cavers around the 70s and maybe 80s. But eventually the larger cave dealers that dealt in far bigger variety of equipment got the okay from Premier to buy from them, and I then lost my relevance and stopped selling. Of course, now it all seems so far back, and we just don't use carbide now. Yes.
How many times have you been to Lechuguilla Cave?
I had never counted how many times I've been in Lechuguilla Cave, but dozens certainly, and that was my dream cave, really, of course. And there was just one find after another, and I already described the subaqueous helictites. Then there were the pool fingers, which turned out to have microbial templates on which the calcite was deposited, and I've received quite a bit of study by New Mexico scientists in particular since that time, and of course the gigantic chandeliers. But I missed being in on the breakthrough into the chandelier ballroom because I was discovering on the same day the pool fingers. So it was a decent trade, really.
Donald, could you describe your visit to Chandelier Graveyard and undercut pool and Persian Gulf?
Chandelier Graveyard, yes, that's an intriguing place out in the far west in Lechuguilla. And I didn't discover that, but I got to go up into it early on. And it has this big avenue that is just covered with gypsum feet deep. It's basically one of what we call gypsum glaciers in Lechuguilla because they're on such a scale. And up at the head of that, there's this grouping of objects that look like gigantic frozen ice Christmas trees with arms radiating out with crystalline selenite, and the biggest one is leaning off at one side. And initially people were saying they were ceiling chandeliers that had fallen, but I personally concluded that they were actually chandelier stalagmites grown in position in that way, and the whole place was just so weird and otherworldly that, in fact, it has a particular point of correspondence with the stories of H.P. Lovecraft. I suspect quite a few of us cavers, being into things like that, have read The Shadow Out of Time, which features a race of ancient Cretaceous beings that once ruled the earth and that were shaped like rugose cones with tentacles. Well, the chandelier stalagmites in there look like rugose cones with tentacles. And I just wish I could get H.P. Lovecraft into there and blow his mind to see how close he was to a real thing on planet Earth. But I suspect that if you were just able to teleport someone there from Manhattan or someplace, they would go mad because they'd think they were on another planet. It would be just so entirely different from anything they would ever have expected.
Yes, Donald, could you touch a bit more on your childhood and tell us where your parents were from?
My parents were originally from Iowa, but they'd both moved to Colorado before I was born. I was actually born in Syracuse, Kansas, but that was only because there was no hospital in Holly at the time, nearest town where they were living at that time. So I think I qualify uniquely for the semi-native bumper strip because I was undoubtedly conceived in Colorado, but born in Kansas. But I didn't get back east of my birthplace until I was 18. Now that's the sort of thing you wanted to know.
John will talk about how okay.
I think. Yes, John.
You're famous for your speleological discoveries, including the ones in the Grand Canyon. Can you tell us a little bit about your archaeological discoveries?
My archaeological discoveries in Grand Canyon, yes, there are some really intriguing ones, and I could spend a lot of time on that too. In fact, if anyone wants to hear more, just talk to me when you can catch me around here. But I found no less than 4 caves in the Grand Canyon that had prehistoric pottery and perishable artifacts intact. It just seemed like wherever I would go in the Grand Canyon, without even trying, I would run across our Indian things. When I was looking for caves and summits, I'd run across Indian things and probably the most spectacular was the Lava Canyon grotto that had 4 prehistoric pots and lined up along a ledge exactly as they had been left. And each one had a sandstone lid that was chipped carefully, shaped to fit each pot. And I was with one other person at the time coming up Lava Canyon, and I had gone up there to check the cave lead, 450 feet. And so I yelled back down to him, "Get your camera up here." And in the meantime, I lit my carbide lamp. It was twilight in there. And when he got there, we took pictures by carbide light, and it turned out that the first 2 pots were empty. The third pot had down in the bottom of it 3 little black on white painted pots, one with a handle, a pitcher, and the zigzag black designs. And there was also a bundle of reed matting that had been strung together with very fine cord, which had disintegrated enough so the reeds were falling apart. But these things, it's been my practice when I find Indian things like that, that they're not mine to collect, but in those days I was a good boy and did what you were told to do, tell a professional. So I told the park archaeologist about these things, and they took a helicopter in weeks later and collected them, and they displayed them for a while at the South Rim. And they were Pueblo II ware, about 850 years old at the time, getting on 900 now, I suppose. But I was told when I visited Harvey Butchert's house a little after that, Roma, his wife, told me to my face that I was a fool for not keeping them for myself. And of course, even then, they would have been worth perhaps several $1,000s, and I knew that. And I just didn't feel it was right to do such things, and I never have. I don't own a potsherd to my name.
For your final question, Donald, today, I was curious if you could tell us the story of your exploration of Hell Below Cave and the interesting experience you had with your colleagues that day.
Well, yes. That was, I think, around December 1961. I may have the years, maybe 1963 or 4. But there was the rumor around the Guadalupes that there was a big cave that had been found by a photographer, Niemeyer, back in the 30s, and I happened to be up at Cottonwood one winter, and so a couple of local people came by saying that they had been told that there was an entrance over on the next ridge somewhere, and that might be the Hell Below Cave that had been rumored, and they hadn't tried to go down it, and so we went over there, Dan Smith, Don Rimbach, and myself from California. I was living in Southern California at that time, and we had rope enough, so we went down there and rigged our rope and dropped down the pit, and at the bottom we found Niemeyer's signature, his party's signatures, but he had not been able to get below that landing. There was another drop off below there, and we still had enough rope, so we got down in there, and here we were in this enormous borehole gallery, and probably most of you have sometime or other been in Hell Below main passage, and there it was for us, virgin, and it was kind of spoiling me. It was getting me to thinking, well, every trip we go up there, we were going to find another huge borehole, virgin cave. But we went wandering back that gallery over the gypsum walls, and all this time, Dan Smith was saying, "I want to go home." It seemed it blew his mind a little too far, and it was too much for him. And we just wouldn't go home until we'd gone as far as we could walk through this thing, and it didn't take that long, but it certainly was a rewarding find, and the cave has proved to be much deeper than that, of course, since then. This 2 hour has gone rather fast, but I have Grand Canyon stories and Lilburn stories and Wyoming. Oh, well, do I have time to talk about Alaska?
I think there's another session coming in.
Oh, okay.
Continue it out in the hall. So,
Okay.
I want to say thank you for a most wonderful hour.
Thank you for inviting me.